Hello and welcome to this most crucial, in fact, it's a pivotal time for India's economy, which in many ways makes this year's budget one of the most important budgets in decades. And the Economic Survey also a difficult and vital document to help us all calibrate the state of our economy. We have been through a war and worse, a war against a virus enemy that nobody really understood and frankly still don't really understand. The devastation it has caused to the economy, to people's lives and livelihood has been enormous. How and by when is India going to bounce back? What major policy decisions should this budget have? Today we have with us, honestly, one of those brilliant minds to help us answer some of these big questions. Arvind Subramanian, one of the finest chief economic advisors that India has ever had. And I mean that seriously. I even say that, Arvind, when you're not in the room. Arvind has been at Harvard after his stint as chief economic advisor. And in this program, I will be taking you through some key data and analysis by Arvind and his colleague Josh Feldman. And they've also been helped by an outstanding team of Vikas Bimble and Abhishek Anand. Okay, so let's get started as we've got a lot of ground to cover. And there will be, I promise you, some amazing insights in what's coming. Arvind, thank you very, very much for being with us. Really looking forward to this. Thanks for sparing the time.
Prannoy, it's always lovely to be on the show and talk to you about the Indian economy.
Arvind, just to start, before I just get into your first bit of data, this is a really, as I mentioned, pivotal time for the Indian economy, a crucial time. It's a big budget and an important economic survey, right?
Yeah. Just to be a little bit provocative, I would say that perhaps after the first full budget of the government in 2015, this is arguably the most important budget because, for two reasons. One, of course, is that, the economy has been devastated by, as you were describing, one of the worst pandemics. And so, we have to recover from what is a huge hit to the economy. But I think also in a more positive sense, it offers the government an opportunity to kind of reset course, given,
right.
successes, the stumbles, the pandemic. It gives it a chance to, reset its approach to policy making, which is what I hope we will discuss over the course of this program.
Yeah. In fact, some of your findings, and I've read all your recent papers, which have been really, you've been working hard for once in your life. And what it tends to show is that the pandemic has been a terrible devastation, but there were problems even before. And we're talking about leading up to the pandemic, things were not all okay, right?
Yeah. So I think in some ways, if you look at the impact on the Indian economy from the budget, it was really from the pandemic. It was really a combination of two things, right? One was, the pandemic and the lockdown response that had to be taken so that economic activity slowed down quite a bit. But that came on top of, I think, pre-existing weaknesses in the economy. This is what we spoke about probably the last time we were together, how, for example,
right.
growth had been slowing down considerably. The financial system, we had this famous
right.
twin balance sheet becoming a four balance sheet problem. And so it's the combination of the two. Exports had slowed down quite a bit. So it's a combination of a pre-existing weakness plus the response to the pandemic. Right. And as you know, for 2020, the year of the pandemic, the IMF says that India will be amongst the most devastated with a decline in GDP of about 8%.
Let's actually have a look at that data. It's the latest IMF data. If we just have a look at look at the current pandemic, how has it affected India? And actually, if you look at the GDP in India in this year of the pandemic, it's gone down 8%, and that's the worst amongst all developing countries. In fact, the average for developing countries is much less than that. If you have a look, it's just 2.4. So we are like 3 times as bad as the average for all developing countries. But there's a little bit of good news actually on the horizon. The IMF forecasts that for next year, if we look at will we bounce back, will we rebound, will India rebound, what does the IMF say? The IMF says yes, not only will it rebound, India will be the best amongst all developing countries in 2021. That is up 11.5%. Remember we went down 8, now forecast to go up 11.5 compared to developing countries which on average are going up 6.3. So almost twice as fast as the average of all developing countries. So that's a good bit of news, but it doesn't mean we'll be back to normal. If we just have a final look before I get to Arvind, what happens if you look at over time, this is what India's big rebound will still be 8% lower by the end of 2021. Now look, first it goes down 8% in 2020, that we've seen the pandemic. Next, it goes up 11.5. Both those combined means it will be just 2.6% above 2019. The bounce back will not be enough to really take us very high. Now, if there was no pandemic, you see that dotted line, that's how India's economy would have gone. And in fact, in the end, where we'll end up in 2021, even if that 11.5% is correct, it will still be 8% short, a shortfall in GDP compared to without the pandemic. Even the bounce back, we're still going to lose 8% of the. That's quite a big loss. It's an intercept change, actually.
Yeah, so I think those are very nice graphics, Prannoy. One caution is that all these numbers are subject to a lot of uncertainty, as you know. I think what we can say for sure is that 2021 will be a good year for India, and that's the good news. Whether it's 11.5 or 7 or 8 or 9 or whatever, who knows? But I think it's going to be a good year.
Or 12 or 14, yeah.
Whatever, yeah. It's going to be a good year for India.
Arvind, if it's a good year, then it's an easy budget. Let's just forget this show. Let's just
exactly. We should go home. So the good news is that it's going to be a good year. The economy is going to bounce back. And it's going to bounce back for 2 or 3 reasons, Prannoy, right? One, of course, is that you go down because activity stopped. But with the pandemic a little bit more under control, we can release all those restrictions. So naturally, the economy will come back. That's point one. Point two, of course, is that, the world economy is rebounding. The IMF has forecast, that trade is going to go up. So that's going to come back as well to help India. Financial conditions are very, very good. Interest rates are very low all over the world. So a combination of just having gone down so bad, the fact that the pandemic is relatively under control in India, and the fact that activity will come back, the restrictions will be lifted, the trade will improve, financial conditions are thing. Then, of course, there's some natural optimism and animal spirits. So all of these mean that 2021 will be a relatively good year. But we cannot stop the program, unfortunately, Prannoy, because there are 2 big challenges that await us, even if we rebound. One, there's going to be just recovering the devastation from the pandemic itself. 15 to 17 million people fewer are employed relative to 2019. And the RBI, remarkably, admirably candid, has said, the NPAs are going to go up from 7.5%, almost double to 13.5%, which means that the financial
non-performing assets, NPA.
Non-performing assets is going to be devastated. So we just have to recover from that. Yeah, that's the first challenge.
Yeah,
and then
they're going to double. Bad debts are going to double.
Bad debt is going to double, exactly.
One thing that you have mentioned in your papers is that India has achieved already some degree of improved economic stability. And if I show some of your data, maybe you could explain it to us in a little more depth. If we just look at how India has improved its economic stability, it's quite interesting. This is all Arvind's data. You see, look at government debt. Under NDA 1, it was up to 75% odd. On the UPA one, it came down a bit to about 60%. Then under UPA 2, 55%. Under the current BJP government, it's about a little bit. So you can see government debt is coming down. And okay, we're a little bit above the average for developing countries, which is 52%, but not that much above. Other ways we've actually had economic stability improving.
We should just clarify to viewers that now we're going to talk about all these numbers until just before the pandemic hit, because that debt number is going to look very different after the pandemic. So now we're just taking stock of the economy until the pandemic hit, because that's going to give us clues about the second challenge. How do you restore dynamism back again?
Exactly. All your data that you've done is just prior to the pandemic. It doesn't have the devastating impact of the pandemic in it. That's an important clarification. If we move on to the other data that you provided about how India's economic stability is improving, inflation is coming down. You can see under UPA 1, it went up. UPA 2, it was at its highest, over 10%. And now under the BJP, it's come right down to around about 5%. Again, this is BJP up to the pandemic, not including the impact of the pandemic. Now, the final thing in this kind of category of economic stability being improved that you have provided, Arvind, which I found really interesting. We move on to the next one. It says that current account balance, that's imports minus exports, that's that trade plus remittances, that current account balance is better. It's improved. You can see that as a percentage of GDP, it's now just 1%. And that's pretty good. A little bit higher than the average for developing countries, but still not bad at all. So these three improvements one could build on. And why have they happened?
So one way of thinking about this, Prannoy, is that, in India in the past has been prone to economic instability and financial crises from, what, Harish Damodaran calls the 4 Fs: food, fuel, foreign exchange, and fiscal, right? These are the things that create, food prices go up, oil prices go up, we don't have enough foreign exchange. All those create, I think, instability and crises in India. And what you've shown just now is that apart from the fiscal situation we'll talk about later, especially after the pandemic, these 3 Fs have been relatively under control. And that goes to the credit of the government that, it believes in macroeconomic stability, it believes in low inflation, generally believes in prudence in terms of running the budget. And our foreign exchange reserves are now 600 billion or so. So we're in a very comfortable. So we are less prone to that kind of instability in the past. And as you said, that offers an opportunity to build upon.
Okay. That is amazing. Now, you also mentioned really another interesting factor that's happening in India increasingly, and that is what you call new welfarism. And it's kind of hardware welfarism, where several kinds of items are provided directly to the poorest. Let's have a look at some of them that you have listed. And it's really excellent data that you've unearthed. The improved access people have had to essential services. Women using bank accounts. In the 10 years, it went from 20 to 35%, but from 2015 to 2019, it's gone up to 60%. That's a sharp increase in women using bank accounts. The other form of new welfarism, we look at that, LPG gas cylinders. We've heard a lot about that. It's one of the most effective election factors that we found among the electorate. The women really appreciated this. In 10 years, it went from 25 to 40%, but in the last 4 years, it's gone up to 60. Electricity, about the same trend, 60 to 75, 75 to 95, but it was already at a very high level, but it's up to 95%. And finally, if you look at toilets, which you listed, yes, they've also gone up, 45 to 60, that's up 15% in 10 years and up another 15% in just the last 4 or 5 years. So what do you make of this new welfareism?
Yeah, so I think, Prannoy, in my view, I think this is probably one of the most significant achievements of the government. Why it's very interesting is because it is a very distinctive approach to the question of redistribution and inclusive growth. How do governments generally do that? Either they provide health and education like public goods, or the UPA builds social safety nets like Manrega, PDS, rights to education, right to food, etc., etc. So that was the UPA approach to this. The BJP and Mr. Modi's government have a very different approach to this, which is essentially to say we are going to provide tangible goods and services, like all the things that you mentioned, to improve the lives of the poor. Now, of course, it's somewhat overhyped. India is not 100% open defecation free, for example, but nevertheless, I think significant improvements have been made. I think what is really distinctive about this is that it combines what I call vision with a calculation. There's genuine conviction that this is good for the poor, but there's also a political calculation here which says that if people can see these tangible improvements in their lives, in a way that you don't see with growth, you tell the average voter growth has gone up, what does it mean to him? But if you say, look, you got chula, you got toilet, you got this, and you say this was all because of a certain benefactor sitting in Delhi, what is called the attribution to who's providing it. My colleague, Professor Nilanjan Sarkar and Yamini Iyer have harped on this attribution. So you materially improve the lives of the poor, you say it's due to government, and that's what enhances also your political success, electoral success. So it kind of combines both.
Two comments on that. This is also being now replicated in many state governments. Andhra Pradesh has done an amazing job. West Bengal is doing by this direct, what you call welfareism. But there are a couple of problems I've noticed in the central government. For example, as you said, slightly hyped, the banking, women's banking has gone up. But when we've been on the campaign trail and talked to women, we say, do you have a bank account? They say, yes, we do. But every time I want to collect my 1,000 rupee pension, the teller says, give me 500, only then will I give you 500. So that last mile, last 6 feet, corruption exists. Then with the LPG gas, they love it. But now refills are becoming a huge problem. It was good initially, but now everywhere you go, they show an empty, they sort of rattle an empty LPG can. And in fact, even many toilets are there, but they're being used for storage because there's no water. So it's a great move, and let me tell you, everybody does appreciate exactly what you said, appreciate it. But I think better implementation still needs to be done.
So I think that, having said the government deserves a lot of credit, I think I would emphasize the two things are, one, it's slightly overhyped. I think the achievements are, good, but not as great as being claimed. And the second, yes, the data is only measuring access to these things. It's not measuring actual use, refills, so on. And surely, I think there are, as you said, implementation deficiencies. But I think this is something that, because the government has conviction about these things, there's also a good chance that they will see the benefits of, continuing to implement it. So I think that's because, one of the things, I think it's interesting what you said about the bank accounts, Prannoy, because what the data on bank accounts is, it's not just women having bank accounts, but actually using it themselves. So kind of the agency that women are getting with it, with all the problems that you said, last mile, I think that's still, so I think it's this new welfareism that I think the government has, really set out its, its vision and probably one of its most successful achievements.
Yeah. And I must say, it is an excellent thing, and it is a direct result of democracy and of elections. And it's a tribute to us. But having said all that, having seen a more stable economy, seeing this welfareism, but some of the figures you bring out on the ground reality about, say, just our children's health. I'll just take you through your figures again. And you could just give us a little more in-depth perspective on that. What about children's health in India? How is it improving? Is it getting worse? It is not a very good picture. If you just look at some of the data on that by Arvind Subramanian, Indian children are suffering still. Look at anemia. In the 10 years 2005 to 2015, it was coming down from 65% of children to still 55%. But now, in the last 4 years, anemia has gone up terribly. That's awful. Moving on to another bit of data that Arvind's about stunting. It's a very, very important issue around the world. And it was coming down from 40% to 30% of children are stunted. Now it's flat. It's not going down anymore. It should be down to zero at least, or near zero. Diarrhea. The trend was downwards, and now it started going back up to where it was, 14 years ago. That is really, really, really disappointing. And finally, if you look at ARI, acute respiratory illness, again, it was coming down. It's going back up or flattening out again. So, Arvind, this is fascinating data that you brought forward, because for all the economic, I just say GDP, and you can talk about all that, but in reality, this shows how is it affecting one section at least of our society, children.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that these data show, I think broadly, Prannoy, that firstly, I think we should be careful and fair and say, the new welfareism that you showed is all because the government has taken the lead, and the government is taking, putting in a lot of political capital into it. All these things that you show, the child in health nutrition, it's a combination of what the central government does or doesn't do, what the state government does or doesn't do, and most importantly, is the economy dynamic and booming, which is providing income and purchasing power and consumption to families, which also then gets translated into better health and nutrition outcomes. And to me, what these numbers suggest is that the health of the child, the nutrition of the child, has been set back in the last few years. And we have to still investigate why that's the case, because take something like stunting, it was coming down remarkably, and then now that trend has reversed itself. So I think the question to ask is, apart from all the specific things on these specific measures that the government is or is not doing, what about the general, is there enough dynamism, economic opportunities in the economy that's lifting people, providing the income and purchasing power? And that's where I think this government has fallen short, and which we will, I think, look in the next set of charts that you're going to provide, I think.
Really astounding a bit of data that you brought out about India's exports over the years, over the decades. India has always considered, we don't export much, not important. We should have been an export-led growth country. And then you show this, and let's have a look at the data. India's exports have grown year by year, third fastest in the world. Vietnam, almost 16%, China, 15.5%, and India, 13.4%. And the world average is 6.9%. And we are India's got very fast growth of exports, really helped our GDP. And it's not just software exports. If you look at manufacturing exports, that's the other data you brought up. And that shows, everybody thinks, this is all software. No. Manufacturing, Vietnam 19.9, China 14, and India, nearly there, third, 12.1. That is just astounding data. And this helps the GDP a lot, hasn't it, over time?
Yeah, so I think, Prannoy, it's a good that you brought up this data, because I think it speaks very much to, the discussions we're having about Atmanirbharta and self-reliance. I think what this reminds us is that when our exports do well, our economy does well, and that we have done well not just in services exports, but also in manufacturing exports. The two, I think, things to keep in mind, however, is that we've done very well in terms of high skill manufacturing exports, but the unskilled manufacturing like textiles, clothing, leather, footwear, toys, all those things which create the jobs, we've not done as well. So that's the first thing to keep in mind when we're talking about policy going forward. The
Very
second
important,
thing,
yeah.
the second thing I think, which is really why I think everyone should take notice of this data, is that, Prannoy, it reminds me a little bit of the debate in the 50s and 60s. There was this whole, export pessimism. India can't export, so therefore let's turn inward. And in fact, one of the few people then who said no, India's exports prospects are good was in fact Dr. Manmohan Singh. He wrote a famous book on this, saying that we shouldn't be pessimistic. So now, in fact, it's likely in a twist of fate. Even though we've done well on exports, we're kind of turning inward, as if forgetting that the way to expanding the Indian economy is by doubling down and expanding manufacturing and low skill manufacturing growth. So this is kind of a reminder that we can do this, and that we should not turn inward because of some sense that, oh my God, we can never export, or the world economy is too too slow to take our
next bit of data. Yes, exactly. Your next bit of data is a bit worrying on that front about looking inward. What you have shown is that we're kind of in an era now returning to a sort of protectionism. Just look at the figures you've brought out, and it is worrying. That at a time when one should be emphasizing openness and getting our exports up, we're seeing exports suddenly collapse. They were growing at 24% from 16, 24 came down to 18, and now in the last 4 or 5 years, they're growing at 3%. Of course, there are external factors also, but 3, that is way below emerging markets average. And let's move on to more worrying data. Even if we look at factors like imports, there's been a big drop in imports. So our entire trade from 31%, 16% to 4%. People say, oh, imports dropping, that's very good. But many exporters also import certain inputs and then use them in their exports. So one would like to see a more robust trade with the rest of the world. And moving on to a couple of other points that you make, and that is on this return to a kind of protectionism. You show that 2017-18, there's been a major hike in import duties. Just look at the number of tariff increases each year. There used to be 160, 150, then recently 140, but in 2017-18, 2,460 times were tariffs increased. That is a return to protectionism. And that, in fact, has affected the average level of tariffs in what India is imposing. And when we increase tariffs, others increase tariffs to prevent our exports. So look at our import duty levels. They used to be around 13%, then they suddenly shot up. And now, and people may not think 2%, 3% is much, but it is huge in a global scenario because others put their tariffs up too to stop us from exporting, right?
Yeah. So I think, this is work I've done with Soumitra Chatterjee, and, essentially what is 2 or 3 things significant about this, Prannoy. One is that it reverses a 20, 30-year consensus that the economy had, that we would gradually open up. And that was the basis of our dynamism. All the exports and imports that you saw, this was the basis of that. So we've reversed, kind of a 3-decade-old, kind of consensus, as it were. The second, of course, implication of this is that if we do this, and of course this comes with other actions that we've taken, for example, not joining certain agreements, and so on. So essentially, it seems to be that policymakers are somehow thinking that by turning inward, our economy can go faster than it is now, and which flies in the face of the evidence of what happened in the 90s and 2000s until about the global financial crisis thereafter. So it's this, why are we not learning from the experience? Why are we changing a policy that has, it's like killing the goose that's laid the golden eggs? Why are we doing that? And that's kind of the open question for policymakers. So Atmanirbharta seems to be flying in the face of the evidence that being open is actually good for the economy. And as you said, when import duties go up, if you want to export, say, clothing, for example, right? But then if all your costs of inputs go up, and then every time in this modern economy with the value chain, goods keep coming in and out, in and out. So, for example, if every time it comes in, your costs are going up and up, your international competitiveness is going to suffer, and those labor-intensive exports that we need to boost will not happen.
This is a very, very important finding, I think, and you can see the impact it is having, according to your data, on our corporate sector. Just let's have a look at how our corporate sector is suffering, and it really is worrying to see what's happening there. You look at the data there that you brought up. If you look at, for example, sales are really falling hugely. They were growing at 11, 17, and 7%. Now they're growing at 3% a year. From 17 to 3, I mean, that is just a frightening impact of all the policies that are, the self-reliance and protectionism. Moving on, let's have a look at even the profits of the corporate sector. What are they like? They're also falling dramatically. This is percentage of GDP. From 2.7% of GDP, profits up 1.4%. Now, people might say, oh, cut profits is a great thing, but these profits are savings and they're reinvested. And the impact is really severe on the economy. So profits